I'm Maurice Verheesen. I'm the coordinator in the Netherlands for the Free Software Foundation Europe. I think we have a very cool schedule today. We have a lot of interesting talks. First, I'll have a talk about 30 years of free software. Then Nico, one of our fellows in the Netherlands, is gonna talk about the future of free software and where we're going. Then Robert is gonna talk about the whole idea of open organizations and open systems. How is that principle influencing other fields? And after that we have an example of that happening with a talk from Diederik, who's going to talk about open hardware and a new platform to make sure that open hardware building happens in the Netherlands. So very exciting schedule. In the afternoon there are two more technical tracks. But the first tracks, they are all more or less about, you know, the general things. All right. Let me see if I have everything covered. We are running a bit late, so I'll see how this presentation goes. I'm not sure if I'm able to do all the slides, but I'll time it a little bit. I have a lot of stories from 30 years of free software, and I'll try to time it so we also have a little moment for any discussions that might come up. Right. Does anybody know who said this? Yes? Yes, exactly. It was Gandhi.
We have it plastered all over our company, Red Hat.
Ah, really? Yeah, and I can imagine why, because it's going to be the how do you say, the red line or the storyline of what I'm about to tell. Because if you look at the history of free software, it actually follows this path. And I'm going to show you this with all the decades that we're going to go through. You can describe it a little bit with one of these sentences. It's also very interesting to see, I recently looked this up, how many free software is there in the world and how fast is it growing? Because that says a little bit about how much influence it's getting. And when you just look at the research that has been done about how many lines of codes have been written within the past 30 years that have a free software license, it's huge. Today there's almost a billion lines of free software code out there. In comparison, the recent study said that Google had 2 billion lines of code, and that's just Google. But all the other software companies have much less code than that. So in the world, I think free software is number 2. When you look at just purely lines of code that have a free software license. And we started out with actually nothing in around 1980. So that's an accomplishment. So where did it all start? Back in the day when we're talking about the 70s here, these two people were working on UNIX. Ken Thompson in AT&T's Bell Labs was working on something called UNIX, and this operating system was spread through universities and other institutions, and it actually came with the computer, because that huge thing that you see here the PDP-11, you could get UNIX running on it. And the source code, although it had copyright, was given to you, and you could tinker with it and do pretty much with it what you liked. Back in those days, another company was growing. This is a letter from Bill Gates to all software hobbyists in the world. And it's a well-known letter because he explains that he can't imagine that people that people should actually pay for software, and that they shouldn't illegally copy it and do stuff with it, because what hobbyists can generate a commercially great professional computer program with all the documentation and all the stuff that is necessary. It's funny because 20 years later we actually get Linux, and Linux is by then pretty mature, and that actually does what he couldn't fathom back in those days. And at some point AT&T became, it was first a regulated monopoly, as they said back in that day, where they were allowed to be a monopolist, and therefore they couldn't actually sell the Unix operating system, because it was used for telephone service, and you couldn't, they weren't allowed to sell it. But that changed in around 1980, 82, somewhere about that time. There was a federal judge who split up AT&T, and then all these little baby bells, as they were called, they needed to generate money to exist. So they looked at the Unix operating system, and they thought, hey, wait a minute, we can actually sell this stuff. So we're going to make it proprietary. You need a license, and we're not going to give you the source code, and you can use it as an operating system. At that same period, we're talking about the early 1980s, in Finland, a guy called Linus Torvalds, who was, I don't know, a young teenager back then, got this computer, and he showed his little sister this basic program, and showed her what it did. And well, she was not very impressed until he changed the hello in a nice sentence about her, and then she thought that he was the coolest guy in the world. And around that same time, when Unix got proprietary, in another part of the country, somebody received this thing. Does anybody know what this is? No. That's a laser printer. It's actually one of the first laser printers in the world. It's from Xerox, and it was installed at MIT, where Richard Stallman was working at that time. And the fun part was Richard Stallman was in the somewhere along a corridor. Right at the opposite end of the corridor there was this printer. So he had to walk past all the offices to fetch his print job. And the previous printer here, and for the previous printer that was there, he installed a program on the printer that would tell him when a print job was finished. And I mean finished as in that it was lying on the printer, not that the print job got sent to the computer. Because he wanted to only walk that way when there was a need for it. and not being stopped by colleagues and being social and other stuff. So they received this printer, and of course he said, okay, that's fine, I have to rewrite my program, so let's where is the software, where is the source code, where can I hook into this printer to make that same program and do the same trick for this thing. Well, the source code was nowhere to be found. So he called Xerox, guys, you made a mistake, where is the source code, because we have this printer but no source code. And then he got an answer that they weren't going to do that any longer. They were not going to give you the source code of the printer. And that scared him. It actually freaked him out. Because he realized what that meant in a very profound way. Because he realized that when you don't have the source code over these devices start to own you instead of you owning those devices. And he started in those days a whole movement doing exactly the opposite. Using copyright law not to restrict people from doing stuff with source code, but actually granting them rights. Granting rights to users to use the software for any purpose, to study the software, to change the software, and to distribute the software as it is, or if you have improvements with the improvements. And that was revolutionary. In 1985, he read his GNU manifesto, where he's written down all those rules, and he came up with a GPL together with his lawyers, and that was a real software license that you could use for free software. Now we're gonna rush a little bit through the history, because at the end of the 80s, in the Netherlands, Professor, I'm not sure if he was professor back then, but anyway, Andrew Tanenbaum he was professor? Okay. He was professor back then. Andrew Tanenbaum from the University of Amsterdam created UNIX, an operating system based on the principles of UNIX, but it wasn't UNIX because he couldn't use UNIX to teach because it was now proprietary. And he didn't have the rights to teach with it. So he created this rather small operating system to teach students how operating systems work. He also wrote a book that came along with UNIX. It was called, this book here, Operating Systems. And right about that time, a little bit later, Linus Torvalds was old enough to actually go to university, and he exchanged his Sinclair computer that he had previously for a regular x86 computer, and he also bought this book because he was very interested in this UNIX operating system, and he read the whole book before the lectures about the operating system actually started. Am I forgetting something? No, because Now the funny part about that PC that he bought was that he actually didn't have all that money to buy an x86. And what happened was that he actually bought it on credit. So he would pay each month to pay off the computer, because back then they were very, very expensive. So Linus went to the university. He received that education about how to create an operating system. he also bought that book from Andrew Tannenbaum, and he started hacking on his brand new computer. And in early or late 1991, he actually wrote a famous email post that he was working on a new operating system. And that was because he was in a discussion with Andrew about MINIX. He actually wanted to use MINIX as a base, but Andrew only wanted that operating system to be as a guidance for students, and he didn't want to have it as a real operating system. And they also had a very fundamental discussion about the fact that MINIX has a microkernel, and well, Linus, he was just starting out and he didn't want to have a microkernel, he just wanted to have a kernel that he could tinker with. And this was a bit easier to write. So they had a very fundamental discussion, and at some point Linus said, well, I'm just going to create something that's not MINIX, but is something new. And it caught on. A lot of people were very interested. Because back in those days you didn't have much else. You had MINIX, you had some BSD that would run on x86, and well, the new thing that Linus was creating. It became a bit of a hit, so a lot of discussions began, and at some point he decided, oh, that's also very interesting, that happened in 1991. He actually met Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman was giving a talk at Linus's, or no, in the neighborhood of Linus University, and he went there together with a friend, and it didn't make much of an impression back then, but some of the ideas caught on, and he knew that Richard had this GPL license, and at some point in 1992 he decided, you know what, I'm gonna GPL this kernel that I'm creating. And a year later, technology. A year later, he actually went to the Netherlands for his first public appearance at the NLGG, or at NLUG, sorry. And it was a very funny story, because he, in his book, he writes that he was very, very cold, and he's from Finland, so it's strange. But actually, he thought that the Dutch people couldn't build houses in a way that would resist the cold. He had very large windows, and they were drafty, and there's a whole rant in the book about that. Very funny. But he gave his talk, and it was a great success. A lot of people from the UNIX community actually were in the room, and actually they had a very good discussion about. Thank you. About Linux, the Linux kernel, and furthered it. Then we progress in the. Am I forgetting something? Yeah, and at the end of 1993, he actually had enough money to pay off his PC, because what happened was that a couple of his friends, they started a fundraiser online for Linus to gather money to pay for his PC. And even before the deadline that he should have fulfilled his dues, he actually could pay off this computer. So that was the first time that he got money from the community to support him doing his work. Then what happened? If you remember Gandhi, this was everything that happened before the 1992, something like that. You could say that was just the whole world not knowing about Linux and ignoring it a little bit, and it was growing, and the whole idea of free software wasn't that widely spread. But from the early 90s, actually, Richard Stallman gave a lot of speeches, a lot of talks, and the people who know Richard Stallman, they know that well, his social skills are for some people challenging to deal with. And what happened in the early 90s was that a lot of people actually made fun about Richard Stallman and his ideas and the things he was doing. So that would be the "then they laugh at you" phase. One of the things that happened in the 90s was a very interesting series of comics where someone from the community, as making fun, a little bit making fun about yourself. They actually created this whole comics about Linus, about Richard, and about another influential guy back in the day, Eric Raymond. And this strip is actually called "Everybody Loves Raymond." So you can look it up. It's a very interesting comics, and it was one of the ones that I wanted to show you because it says, I'm not sure if you can read it because I think it's pretty small. It says, "I just saw on Slashdot that someone has started an online comic starring you, me, Linus, and Linus Torvalds. We're living together in a flat for some reason. Do I look good?" That's what Eric Raymond asks. "Not really. In fact, in the last panel, I've got you in a headlock." "Hey, no way that would ever happen." "Free as in freedom, bitch." And then he says, "I'm gonna open source a can of Chuck Norris on you, ass Stallman." And that's funny because back in those days, there was a rift occurring between a group of people within the free software community that didn't all believe the whole political idea behind free software, that free software should be free because it should be free in a freedom sense. There was a whole group of people that were impressed by the development model, the open source software development model, that you work together in teams and create software, and they emphasized those aspects. And back in those days, they felt the need to distance themselves and change the whole narrative, and to make it less about freedom and more about the practical aspects. So they also came up with a new name, open source software. That was a term made up by Eric Raymond and a couple of influential people back in those days, and they said, well, we're going to use the term open source software instead of free software, because free in English is very confusing, because a lot of people think it means gratis instead of free as in freedom. So there were a lot of practical reasons why they thought it needed a better term. Well, Richard Stallman didn't agree at all, because he really wanted to have that philosophical or the political goal in there. So he was very opposed, and still is very opposed to this idea. In 1993, this guy, Georg Greff, also started using free software. He got his first PC, and a friend of him gave him GNU Linux. And that's important because he'll come back a little bit later. In the 1995, that term open source was created, like I just mentioned. Also, the Apache web server came into maturity. And then in 1998, things starting to get really interesting. Because at some point, Microsoft actually delivered a browser with their operating system, and competing browsers had a very tough time dealing with that, because people immediately had a browser and they didn't even think to search for something else. And in 1998, Netscape said, well, okay, we're going to open source our browser. We're going to release the code. It was also the time that Google started. And Google Google still uses a lot of free software, and back then they used a program called Backrub, and that was written in Java and Python and was running on Linux. And that had a lot of people worried, because you have these competitors. At some point, instead of just going away, they kind of created a competitor that would not be playing on the same level as for instance, Microsoft was playing back in the day. And we see that the whole idea about let's make fun of those guys is actually changing to we need to do something about these guys. One of the first things that came to light later, but it played in the heads of people within Microsoft, were the release of the Halloween documents. Those were internal documents from Microsoft, and they were released, I don't know, a couple of years later, but they were written in 1998. And there Microsoft is very scared about the whole open source / free software movement and what it could do to its business model. And they actually helped the whole discussion, because they actually admitted that free software can actually be better than proprietary software, which is very helpful indeed of them. But of course, they never meant it to have those internal documents be published. So it was a very important time. It was the switch when actually the status quo thought, okay, jetzt ist Schluss mit lustig. We have to take on these people and do something about it. And Georg, in that time, became the spokesperson, in 1998, became the spokesperson for the GNU project in Europe. So a little bit later, in 2001, he gathered a couple of people, and I'm gonna try to show them to you, because it's almost everybody in the picture, but it's this guy, Bernard, Georg, oh, I forgot his name, Peter, and of course our GNU GPG founder and creator Werner Koch started with the Free Software Foundation Europe. And the guys that you see also in the picture, some of those guys came in a month later, so they actually also are founding members. Some of them actually are a little bit more later, but this is one of the earliest pictures that I could find about the group of people that started the FSFE in Europe, or the FSFE in general. So there you see how Georg in the early 90s got involved with Linux, and actually at some point started the Free Software Foundation Europe. Let me see, how much time do we have? I think I'm gonna have to make a choice here. In the early 2000s also Facebook started. And why do I call Facebook here? Because it was actually also a lot of free software that was used to create Facebook. It was created with PHP and Linux. And in the early 2000s, it was also Microsoft Steve Ballmer that started to compare Linux with cancer, which of course wasn't very nice of him to do, but you could really sense back in that time, you know, in 1998, they got scared, and by 2001 they were actually panicking that because all these interesting companies that were growing, like Amazon and Google back then, they were heavily using Linux. and they were very afraid about what would happen. So in 2001 the FSF Europe got founded. Then in the Netherlands we started to get more politically involved because the motie Vendrik, which was there was a motie that was built to make sure that free software was used in the government, the Dutch government, and that we were going to use open standards to communicate. To guide the government in the Netherlands for doing this, they founded the OZOS, which was an organization that government agencies could go to, and they would explain to you how to install Linux and very practical advice how to get your organization started with free software. In that same time, Facebook got founded, which was heavily relying on free software. Amazon as well. Of course, Twitter, which is a Ruby on Rails shop from the beginning, got started. And around that time, also the OZOS, the program from the Dutch government, considered itself finished. Well, they didn't receive any funding. But not much had happened within the Dutch government, at least not much that was visible. There were, in the early 2000s, a lot of people were not using free software at all. By 2006 it actually sneaked in, but a lot of people were still talking about it without actually realizing that some of it was already in use, especially in the data center. But for that reason, the NOIV, which was also a political program, got started. And that was meant to, again, make sure that the government started to use open source, free software, and open standards. It kind of succeeded because it tried to at least make open standards a very big issue, and because of the open data hype that was starting back then, it kind of succeeded. But still, it's very difficult when you look at municipalities. They still struggle a lot with the whole concept of free software. But not in industry, because in industry, by the year 2010, you see that there isn't any startup in the United States that gets started on proprietary software. I don't think any software that's being used or being built right now is done on proprietary platforms. When you look at industry, it really has changed. And in 2009, that's 8 years later, the FSF Europe was 800 people. I can tell you today, which is not 8 years later, we are much, much bigger than the 800 people that was back then in 2009. So you see that it's really, really, really catching on. And I actually have proof for this. If you look at economic proof for this, this is a graphic that you guys can't read because it's very small. I see. Well, you see 3 lines here and 3 lines here. The lines on the lower end actually kind of like stay the same. What you are looking at are the stock prices of Google, Facebook, Amazon, Oracle, SAP, and Microsoft. And guess what? The guys that are using a lot of free software and are building their companies on free software and actually contributing in the community are much more valuable than the companies that are using the proprietary software and exploiting that. When you look at the lower line, those are the lines of SAP, Oracle, and Microsoft. And it's really funny that you can actually see the point where this happens, where they actually go apart. I always thought it happened earlier, but it actually was in the beginning of 2015 where you see this trend really visible, that there is a difference between these companies. Doesn't of course says it all, but you actually get a good feel for that the whole idea, the whole concept of being able to act quicker on market demands and change your business model and change the way you are working because you have the freedom to do so, actually make sure that you can generate more money. And of course each year we would ask ourselves, is this the year of the Linux desktop? Well, I think we asked the wrong question. I think in everything else but the desktop there is Linux. So we have been sleeping a little bit because I think we've already won. When you look at those share prices and when you look at how software is being developed these days, the core principles, especially when you look at from an open source perspective, the way we work together, it's already there. And the whole idea about freedom and the whole concept about the political idea behind free software is getting there as well. These companies didn't make that much value because they were locked in. They made that much value because they were free and they were able to change when they needed to. And of course, when you look at the enormous amount of free software code that's out there, and it's only growing, and the quality is getting better, and the way our community is growing, there's no doubt about it. This is the way forward. So that's nice, but not all is nice, because this week I saw this happen. And this is something I would really love to discuss with you a little bit. What it says here was that two developers of a free software program called Popcorn Time reached a settlement with Brein, which is a copyright organization in the Netherlands. And Brein convinced these two developers that they should not work on that piece of free software. Now, of course, you can have all kinds of opinions about Popcorn Time and what it does. But what triggered me was the fact that you have a free software license that gives you the right to use the software and to share it and to build on it and to do anything with it that you want. But that there is still a way in which you could be compelled to stop doing that. And I've been talking to some lawyers about this. The ones who are following me on Twitter have seen that discussion. Some lawyers said, well, maybe if you go to court about this case, you would actually have to prove that your contributions that you as a developer made in this project would lead to an offense. Would lead to somebody actually downloading something illegal and then committing an offense. And another lawyer said, well, you don't actually need to do that whole causality thing. And you can just argue, hey, Popcorn Time does something that we as a society don't like, so we're going to say you shouldn't be building it, you shouldn't be using it. It didn't go to court, so we don't know. We don't know how the judge would rule in such a case. But I got a bit scared, because what happens if this happens to our encryption software that is now free software? What happens if in all the discussions that we have about national security, at some point somebody says, hey, we should do something about encryption. We should limit encryption, or how do you say, outlaw encryption at all, or build backdoors into encryption. That would be a relative easy political consensus, because you couldn't argue that, oh, we need encryption. Yeah, of course we need encryption, but we're going to limit it a little bit so that also our security agencies can actually do something about it. That would put free software in a very difficult position, because you can't limit free software in that way. There is no guy or person or organization or a company that you could go and say you need to limit the encryption or you need to build in a backdoor because it's free. That's the whole idea. And what would happen then to the developers of this software? Are we going to have criminal cases where free software developers get called into a courtroom and are forbidden to work on GNU PG? I think we need to have a very serious discussion about this, because this is something that we can't we need to get in front of this discussion. We need to say, hey, there is something, there's software out there. You can try to say that you want to limit encryption, but in practical, in real life, it's not gonna be that easy. And that's a scary discussion. So I think what I would like to say about this, as a free software advocate, is that you need to think about the possibility that even in a Western country, when laws change in this way and something is going to be done about encryption, that you need to be careful, because you could end up in court. And I hate to say this, but as a spokesperson or as an advocate, I have to at least mention this. And I hope we can, that's my last slide, get a lot of funding and get a lot of support from all of you. Really get into this discussion about encryption and make sure that we don't do anything stupid. The second we create laws against encryption because of national security, that's going to be, for all the reasons, we know all the reasons why it's bad, but we really, everybody in this room needs to get into this discussion with everybody at the kitchen table, at parties, at whoever you can tell this to, why encryption is a good thing to have, and why we shouldn't do something, or we shouldn't create laws that are gonna hamper it in a serious way, because in the end it's going to hurt us more than it is going to make us safe. So we won, but there's still a lot of work to do, and I hope we can all do it together.